Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Saffa. I'm an associate of the Caston Centre. Before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. As has become our custom, the Caston Centre will be tweeting this event, so if you are interested in following on Twitter or you're interested in tweeting yourself, the hashtag is CC Sierra Leone. Okay, so as you all know, we are very privileged to have Emmanuel, Saffa, Abdulai with us this afternoon. Emmanuel is a lawyer by profession whose only brother was abducted and killed by rebel forces during the civil war in Sierra Leone. In 2003, Emmanuel established the Society for Democratic Initiatives, which is an NGO working to entrench democratic governance and protect and promote human rights. During Sierra Leone's transition, Emmanuel worked at both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So please join me in welcoming Emmanuel, Saffa, Abdulai.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I must say I am particularly privileged to be here today to talk to you about transitional justice in Sierra Leone. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the government of the Melbourne Bar Association for having worked so tirelessly to bring me here. It took us almost a year to get a visa to come to Australia. You know, it is interesting when I have traveled quite extensively, and when I wanted the Australian visa, and I realized that I have to go to South Africa from Sierra Leone, which is actually like a 13-hour journey by plane, and you get the visa. And I inquired with the Australian. High Commission in South Africa. But that was before. In fact, I had been informed by the website that I have to go to Ghana. So I flew to Ghana for a visa, and I was told, no, you have to go to Kenya. So I went back to Sierra Leone and spent 2 weeks trying to put together things to go to Kenya. And then when I called Kenya, so no, we moved to Pretoria. We don't issue visas for Sierra Leone. So, but it took us almost 8 months. So and I was supposed to have been here last year, and I'm sure this event was advertised. But like I was telling Sally this just a couple of minutes ago, the world has developed into so much dangerous place that it's very natural that people will try to preserve their societies and communities. So I don't have any ill feelings for having gone through this rigorous visa process. You know, if the world was a peaceful place, I mean, anybody can just wake up and travel to another place. But certainly, I am very glad to be here finally, and I hope this event will be mutually beneficial to all of us. Now, I come from Sierra Leone, where over the past decade, few countries have experienced the tragedy and devastation that Sierra Leone has. A brutal civil war beginning in 1991 and ending in 2001 brought the country to its knees, displacing nearly half of the country's population while causing 750,000 deaths. Sierra Leone's collapse, though, is somehow perplexing, given the optimistic outlook upon its independence in 1961. It attracted tourism and appeared to have been the beginning of a democratic governance. Most importantly, the country was and still is wealthy in diamonds, with the Eastern Congo district producing valuable gems in high demand throughout the world. Maybe this is the cause that Sierra Leone was endowed with diamonds. Sierra Leone's capital, called Freetown, became the British colony in 1808. The Creole population of Freetown, the descendants of former slaves who settled in Sierra Leone, became active members of the colonial administration and developed schools, businesses, and even a vast majority in Freetown. The university attracted students from neighboring countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, and other parts of West Africa, earning Freetown the nickname of the Athens of West Africa. Freetown prospered under colonial rule, with a highly educated Creole class performing many roles in the administration. The success of Freetown, however, masked the underlying weaknesses of colonial administration and its lack of control over the hinterland. Policies during the colonial era reflect tensions between the administration in Freetown and local chiefdoms throughout the country. While British Parliament in London, wishing to keep colonial costs low, Freetown had to develop a cost-effective way to increase trade with homeland and the hinterland. The result was a highly decentralized system in which local chiefs were allowed to maintain traditional roles of authority so long as they maintained political and social order and loyalty to the British government. Loyal chiefs received access to state resources and benefited from trade with the coast. Freetown thus continued to develop as loyal chiefs increased their wealth. The discovery of diamonds in the 1930s in the Eastern Corner region highlighted the structural weaknesses of political systems. Although Corner diamonds could potentially serve a tremendous function for the country as a whole, the colonial administration lacked the authority in the remote regions needed to fully exploit its resources. Sierra Leone was founded by the British philanthropists in 1789 during the anti-slave campaign in Europe. It was created as a haven for free slaves who fought on the side of the British in the American Civil War of Independence and who had become social problems in England. When the slaves were resettled, the colony, now the capital, was named Freetown. As such, Sierra Leone is one of the oldest polities in Africa. Sierra Leone is a very small country in the west coast of Africa. It borders with Liberia in the east and southeast, Guinea in the northeast, and the Atlantic Ocean in the west. It covers an area of approximately 73,326 square kilometers, just the size of the state of Maryland in the US. The country gained independence in 1961 from the United Kingdom and became a republic in 1971. It is divided into 4 administrative districts: the Western Province, which is now comprised of 2 districts, the Rural and Urban District, and the North, South, and Eastern region. The provinces are divided into 12 districts, which are further divided into 149 chiefdoms. The country hosted the first university, like I mentioned, and because of this, it was referred to as the Greek capital, Athens of West Africa. According to the 2006 census report, there are about 6 million people living in Sierra Leone, though this is said to be exaggerated. By the time Sierra Leone gained independence in 1961 under the leadership of its first Prime Minister, the country's democratic development was the envy of the region because of a vibrant Westminster type of parliamentary democratic legacy. A perplexing paradox. Despite all these natural resources, Sierra Leone is not only one of the poorest countries in the world, but it is also just emerging from 10 years of one of the most sordid and nauseous armed conflicts ever fought on this African soil in the world. From 1991 to 2001, the protracted war forced about half a million Sierra Leoneans to flee the country, turning them into one of Africa's largest refugee populations. At least 75,000 Sierra Leoneans were killed, more than 10,000 had their limbs brutally chopped off, over 5,000 children were forced to fight alongside adults, up to 10,000 civilians were forcibly abducted, and more than 3,000 communities were completely destroyed. A recent report from Physicians for Human Rights entitled War-Related Sexual Violence in Sierra Leone revealed that in addition to the practice of chopping off limbs and other body parts of men, women, and even infants, there are reports of pregnant women disemboweled and women and children raped and forced to be sex slaves. The complex humanitarian situation, a product of the war, exacerbated the already grim quality of life. The Sierra Leonean life expectancy of 39 years is the lowest in the world. 60% of the adult population is illiterate, 36% do not have access to health care, and 34% do not have access to clean water. So what we take for granted in the Western world is completely not present in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone's civil war officially ended in 2002, leaving national institutions eroded and the people traumatized, and poverty as the order of the day. Almost 7 years after the war ended, national rebuilding is underway and democracy is slowly becoming an accepted means of governance for the people of this tiny West African nation. With the physical threat of war gone, there is now the need to also eradicate the psychological threat of war by strengthening democratic institutions and tenets that will empower the people to keep an eye on the government and ensure that the harbingers of the decades of conflicts are avoided. The vast majority of the population has seen little improvement in their lives, and the same social tensions that led to the civil war are in danger of erupting again in the Department of International Troops. The consequence of the above retrogression is a country imploding and exploding into chaos because the center can no longer hold. Inevitably, anarchy descends onto the country. Sierra Leone was no longer able to hold itself together, so it exploded, leading to one of the nastiest and most brutal wars in human history. A lot of people will ask why humanity descended into such a situation. According to history, in the early 1990s, the Revolutionary United Front rebels ignited their war against the All People's Congress. In 2002, even after the RUF had been overthrown, the APC had been overthrown, and the military junta had taken over, the war escalated year by year as the rebels embarked on a schizophrenic orgy of maiming men, women, and children. The unique but disgusting trademark of the RUF was crude amputation of the helpless victims to inject fear into the populace for political capital. Wanton and indiscriminate murder, senseless arson on private and public property, violent rape of girls, grandmothers and boys, abduction of girls for sexual slavery, and capturing of boys as armed combatants. Corruption after sustained kleptocracy. With huge deposits of minerals and no checks against kleptocracy, the government institutionalized corruption after it took over power in 1960. But this was only possible by further suppressing the opposition. 4 years after it took power, the All People's Congress government consolidated its rule. It reduced the number of the Sierra Leone People's Party parliamentarians, which is the main opposition, from 32 to 12, through naked coercion, intimidation, and by crudely unleashing state thugs on anti-APC constituencies. With parliament made docile, the APC government took firmer control of the army, where nearly 90% of the officers that were in the army when it took power in 1960s were run from one region. In 1977, after fear gripping the populace, with the free media terrorized into silence and with the economy beginning to stagnate, demonstrations were held by students of the Furabe College at the University of Sierra Leone, which I mentioned earlier, called the Athens of West Africa. Those demonstrations spiraled into nationwide violent protests. There were deaths. Civil war threatened on the hinterland of the Mende-controlled south of Sierra Leone. The government cared very little about this. According to William Reno, the APC created what he termed as a shadow state, which is practically having a patronage system which operated where businessmen who became very powerful and created their own state and governed the state from within their circles. They were not following the rules and regulations of Sierra Leone. They created their own rules and they forced people into doing the things that would only create benefits for themselves. So therefore, you realize that from one-party dictatorship, there's only one way Sierra Leone could have escaped from the grip of dictatorship. And that was when the people started craving for war. And only war would save Sierra Leone. But interestingly, when the war came, it wasn't war against the system, it wasn't war against the government, it was war against the people who have craved for war as a salvation to the one-party dictatorship and kleptocracy. And in the war era, like I've explained, the bestiality that followed was completely unheard of. As a result of that, the international community had to intervene to stop the brutal tactics of the RUF. It is interesting to note that Sierra Leone has not been the only country that has plumbed into conflict in Africa because of the lack of good governance and because of the creation of shadow states by businessmen and government, because of corruption. Many other countries, not just in Sierra Leone or Africa, many countries that have emerged from authoritarian rules in Eastern Europe have also experienced the same situation. So it is interesting when you talk about issues of transitional justice. The issue of transitional justice is how the country will grapple with its past, how to bring together victims of authoritarian and repressive regimes, and how to record the happenings of those authoritarian regimes and create a society where there will be complete reconciliation between the people who have suffered during the authoritarian regimes. So therefore, when the war ended in 2001, there was a clarion call within the international community for the creation of transitional justice mechanisms that would not only record what went wrong in Sierra Leone, but I would also bring to book perpetrators of violence, perpetrators of mayhem, and ensure that never again humanity is allowed to descend into such a nasty way of doing things. It is very strange, well, not strange, it's very unique that Sierra Leone instituted the dual transitional justice mechanism. But before talking about that, let me just, for the benefit of all of us, talk about the issue of justice. Every time when a country emerges from war, people talk about there's a need to get justice. There's a need to set up institutions that will seek justice for victims. And sometimes people seek retributive justice, which is setting up courts and ensuring that you try perpetrators of violence. And sometimes people seek restorative justice. Restorative justice is about bringing people to talk about what went wrong and embrace each other through truth-seeking and truth and reconciliation commission. At the end of the conflict in Sierra Leone, there was a Lone Peace Accord, which actually sanctioned the creation of the Truth Commission, which is the restorative justice aspect of seeking justice in a post-conflict situation like Sierra Leone. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was given a mandate to record the antecedents of the war and ensure that victims and perpetrators come together, embrace each other, and move on with their lives. At that point in time, the United Nations said, no, we cannot just talk about restorative justice without retributive justice. We are not part of this. We are part of the entire agreement, but we are not part of this particular section. We will support the TRC program, which is the Truth and Reconciliation program, but we also will want to bring to book those who bear the greatest responsibility for violence and perpetration of mayhem in Sierra Leone. So there was huge international politics as to which one of the institutions were supposed to be set first, whether the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Special Court. And it is only in Sierra Leone that I've seen, Sierra Leone is one of the few countries where they've established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission almost simultaneously with the court, the retributive justice mechanisms. It's an interesting interplay because, as I will mention later on, there were a lot of structural and institutional problems for setting both institutions together. However, it is important to note that transitional justice, when the concept emerged in the early 1990s from Eastern Europe, it's not a concept that the Africans know. It's not a concept originated from Africa. And so it is almost the same situation where you have an African historian saying it's an alien concept. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, it was going to be very difficult for people to buy into the process of setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and also the court process. In a typical Sierra Leonean society, if you are wronged by your neighbor, you go to the chief, and the chief will adjudicate it in a very quiet way and ask for apologies and reconciliation, or very minor issues like you pay reparation. In a more conceptual framework, you pay small amount of money, and that's the end of it. It is completely un-African, traditional African society for someone to wrong you and you send the person to jail. And in fact, that is a concept that we still continue to grapple with, even when we talk about being a civilized nation or we being a British colony. Because when you have somebody commits an offense like sexual offense and you bring the person to court, the victims will not show up to testify. They will think that it's going to be a grave wrong against community to send your neighbor to jail. So when we speak about concepts like transitional justice, like Truth Commission, it was difficult for the populace, for the Sierra Leonean population, to buy into this concept. But I'm going to talk briefly about the Special Court. Many of you have heard about the Special Court, and the Special Court was created primarily because the United Nations twisted the government and said we need to bring to book perpetrators of violence. And as a result, we want you as a government to ask the United Nations to set up a special hybrid tribunal that will use both Sierra Leonean and international law and ensure that the perpetrators of violence are brought to book. So the government of Sierra Leone wrote a letter to the UN asking them to set up a special court. And of course, it was almost consensus that there was a need for a special court to try both the rebels and pro-government forces. This was also a very difficult thing to grapple with. From the onset, there was this huge institutional tension because the rebels have fought almost entirely against the government of Sierra Leone and the people of Sierra Leone. And in the process, the central government collapsed. The vigilantes came together, they formed themselves into civil defense forces and fought to defend their communities, their towns, and their chiefdoms. In the process of defending the chiefdom, they also been taught to using the same violent tactics that the rebels use in unleashing mayhem on the people. So, these vigilantes have also violated international law, the conduct of war, but they had done so in the conduct of defending their communities and promoting or trying to restore democracy in Sierra Leone. So the purpose of waging war or defending their communities was actually to defend democracy and protect their people. How do you bring these people to book? How will the Sierra Leoneans accept their heroes being brought to book? it took a lot of negotiations for the government of Sierra Leone to accept that whether you fought on the side of government or on the RUF side, you needed to be brought to justice. And the moment the decision was taken, it almost eliminated the special court on the people. Because the leaders of the vigilante civil defense force were arrested. And it looks like this is a court against us. How can our people fight for us, defend us, and now they're being tried for fighting for us? And questions were asked as to where were the international community when we were suffering? You know, so that was one of the major problems with the special court. It was very okay for the people who wanted the RUF, which is the rebels, to be tried. That was very okay, but the moment the government agreed that even pro-government forces would be tried, then it became a problem. As I'll explain later on, even in the final phase of the special court, the Sierra Leonean judges and international judges have completely different views as to the culpability of the vigilantes. So the special court was set up. The mandate of the court was to try those who bear the greatest responsibilities. So there was issues about getting the commanders. There was issues about getting the ringleaders. How do you get the ringleaders or commanders of a loose network of vigilantes who were fighting to protect their society, who were not a traditional armed force in the context of international law? That also became a little bit of a problem. And so when you look at the judgment of the special court, you will see that there's a loose definition of command structure, command responsibility, and who a commander is. But because the jurisdiction of the court was to try those who bear the greatest responsibility, it's only brought to justice 10 people. 10 people tried between 7 to 9 years, and all convicted, and millions of dollars spent. Brought many questions to Sierra Leoneans as to why do you have to spend $200–300 million on bringing 10 people to justice? Why not put $200–300 million into reparation programs and rebuilding societies? These are the issues that the special court had to crack away. The international community strenuously argued that we cannot put justice money into reparations. We cannot put justice money into rehabilitation programs. We have to bring to book people. So the special court went on and tried 10 people. 2 of them died in custody, as has always been the case, like Miller Submission. When you have long years of trials, you get the accused persons dying in custody, and at the end of the day, these were the 2 main ringleaders. One was the leader of the Civil Defense Force, which was a militia group, and one was the RUF leader himself, for the Sanko, who had initiated all of this violence. Both of them died, and so at the end of the day, it was a question of do we really get the real people convicted, or do we just get the soldiers, small soldiers? Also, another question that emerged from this limited jurisdiction is the commanders were sitting somewhere asking their soldiers to fight. The middle level ranking officers were those who were actually perpetrating violence. Yet you use those who really perpetrated violence to prosecute the commanders who were not in the field, and you leave out the middle level officers. There are questions as to what justice were you meting out to be? Or was it just a symbolic kind of conviction that was being looked at? The special court introduced a couple of unique programs, and I think this was because they were trying to break away from the international ad hoc tribunals that had been set before it, the one for Yugoslavia and the one for Rwanda. So one of the things that they brought in was the office of the principal defender. So at this point in time, when the special court was set up, they set up an office of the principal defender that would coordinate defending the accused persons. One of the things that I was discussing with Sally and her colleague, he said, when you talk about justice, you want everybody to be tried on fair footing. You want a clear platform where justice will be seen. But because the special court was located in Sierra Leone, most of the Sierra Leonean lawyers were reluctant to defend the RUF and the CDF, because these were people who, a lot of people had thought, they have killed my brother or my cousin, they have committed all of these atrocities. It was difficult to get a defense lawyer. And that's how I got into working for the court, because I was working as a lawyer in the civil society organization, and I thought it would be fair to provide lawyers for the accused persons, so to work for the court. But even at that, the opprobrium that you get from the public for defending the area, for defending people who everyone perceived as demons, questions the efficacy of the justice that you mete out in such an institution. It was a brilliant idea, setting the special court in Sierra Leone, because justice was closer to the people. And it was good for the people of Sierra Leone to see accused persons in the dock and to listen to testimonies. It was a brilliant idea to get people walk into the court and sit there and watch alleged perpetrators brought to book. But it was also a disadvantage that anybody associated with these accused persons will be ostracized. So interestingly, there is an advantage as to the court being in Sierra Leone and being out of Sierra Leone. So at the end of the day, you also realize that when the president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, when he was indicted and brought to Sierra Leone, there was a huge tension in the sub-region of West Africa, that the Liberians were going to invade Sierra Leone, and this was the reason why he was eventually moved to The Hague to be tried in the Netherlands. With the special courts completing its mandate, we also turned your attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was also going on simultaneously. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was practically an institution that would bring people together to explain their story, explain their sufferings, and the TRC was expected to do, to record the findings and come up with a recommendation as to what went wrong, firstly, and what institutions Sierra Leone was supposed to build or set up to ensure that we don't go back to a conflict situation. The TRC came out with a report, even though very late, but the report highlighted that one of the things that caused Sierra Leone's conflict was greed and corruption. That as a result of the fact that the elites wanted to have a free way of enriching themselves, they destroyed state institutions, they killed the opposition, suppressed the media, and then the society imploded. The TRC also came out with specific recommendations. There are recommendations that they term as long-term, the immediate, and those to be considered. And as a result of that, governments were supposed to set up human rights commissions, office of the ombudsman, strengthen the judiciary, and build a lot of institutions and ensure that free and fair elections were held. But when you have these two institutions, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Special Court, the question that will always emerge is, if I went and testified in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I committed atrocities against people, but I want to be forgiven and I want to live again, can the Special Court indict me because of those testimonies? But if I went and testified that I saw Mr. XYZ committing an offense, and the Special Court used me as a witness against Mr. XYZ, how were these two institutions supposed to play? The TRC said that none of its evidence could be used at the Special Court. And the TRC was empowered to exist above all laws. However, the Special Court of Sierra Leone was set up as an international institution sitting in Sierra Leone. He wasn't part of the judicial system of Sierra Leone. And so the special court had its own jurisdiction, and the laws of Sierra Leone cannot govern the special court. So at the point in time when the prosecutors of the special court decided to use evidence from the TRC, they said, we're not part of the laws of Sierra Leone. We're not part of the TRC Act. But it was a very tense relationship as to how the special court of Sierra Leone and the TRC could operate simultaneously and not interfere with the functions. There was a particular incident when the leader of the militia, of the vigilante group, the CDF, had testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. He had been arrested. He had been indicted and arrested by the special court. But the TRC realized that in order to create a historical account of Sierra Leone, there's a need to get him. There's a need to get his own side of the story. The special court refused handing him over to the TRC because they thought that would be prejudicial to his case. So in the findings of the TRC, there's no account of him being the leader of the vigilante group that defended democracy and societies against the rebel. That was a missed opportunity. There was a huge tension. There were motions filed across offices, and at the end of the day, the TRC backed down. So when we talk about transitional justice, one of the things that has to be looked at is how do we, do we get peace before justice? Do we get peace and justice together, or do we get justice before peace? These were the questions that Sierra Leone had to grapple with. And Sierra Leone went to getting peace and justice simultaneously, bringing people to reconcile, building monuments, paying reparations to communities, but at the same time trying people who had committed grave atrocities. There were huge tensions, there were fusions. In explaining these dynamics, it is evident that both institutions played a significant role in bringing Sierra Leone from the ashes of war to building democratic institutions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, firstly, was able to record in an impartial terms what went wrong, that Sierra Leone plunged into civil conflict, even though the TRC or the Special Court also did the same. But the TRC was much more in a less adversarial situation. People were more willing to come out and testify about things that happened. A TRC process also brought people who would otherwise not have come together. I mean, people were able to embrace perpetrators. I remember one vivid story when I was working at the TRC when one of the first victims of the area was a man whose limbs were chopped off, both of them. And he could identify this young child soldier who did it. The TRC brought both of them together, explained their stories, and the young man said, I cannot even recall. I cannot even recall because I think it was the time when I was injected with cocaine. So what I did, I don't know what I did, but I apologized. And this man who has been disabled for the rest of his life said, I forgive you. He walked over to him and they embraced each other. In normal circumstances, these are people that would never have crossed their path again. But the TRC was able to do that. And those kind of symbolic reconciliation in public allowed Sierra Leoneans to forgive each other and move on. And today we have the TRC report in 3 large volumes that went into detail of how government use corruption and barbaric tactics to entrench power. Those histories that have been recorded will serve generations to come. And we have a blueprint in that report that is giving recommendations as to what government should do and what government should not do. It's the same situation with the Truth and Reconciliation, with the Special Court for Sierra Leone. with the Special Court for Sierra Leone, we are able to say never again will anybody be allowed to use brutal tactics to kill people and walk out scot-free. So the first thing we've done with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to record the things that went on. And with the Special Court is to stamp out impunity. As you all know, the former president of Liberia has just been convicted for 50 years. Even though I have questions as to the trend at which international justice has gone, and how you made 50 years for someone who did not really commit the offense, who you charged with aiding and abetting. But I think bringing a sitting head of state to book is a significant, symbolic way of stamping out impunity. It's a way of sending a message to African leaders, to African warlords, that you cannot just kill your people, you cannot just kill people and think you will go scot-free. Despite the fact that there was this huge tension between whether to bring the vigilante civil defense group and the rebel forces to book, the very fact that that bold step was taken also sends a message, a stronger message, that no matter who you fight for, and no matter on whose side you are, the world has moved to a situation where you have to respect the laws of war, and where you cannot employ brutal tactics to gain power. The Special Court was based in Sierra Leone, and in so doing, the international community built a very massive structure in Freetown. When you drive through Freetown at night, you would think that this is alien spacecraft that has just landed. You know, because sometimes you will find the other areas very dark and you find the Special Court just sitting in the middle of the city. I think that facility will be used for years for various purposes, either to bring all the dictators to trial in Africa, or as a conference center, or as a library. And I also think the legacies of the court are very, very much important. One of the things I wanted to talk about briefly is the disadvantage of having local judges sit at international tribunal. I mentioned that earlier. In setting up the Special Court, the United Nations agreed that Sierra Leone will appoint one judge to each trial chamber. There were 2 trial chambers, and there was one appeals court chamber. So there were 1 Sierra Leonean judge sitting. Because of the involvement of the Sierra Leoneans, and I was also, when I went to Kenya a couple of years ago, advising them on setting up a Special Court. This is something that I mentioned. At the end of the trial, the Sierra Leonean judge was the only dissenting opinion at the trial chamber of the civil defense forces. He said, I don't think you can convict the vigilante leaders for what they did. His argument was, it's a very brilliantly crafted argument. He said, in order to convict someone for war crime or crime against humanity, the purpose of attack have to be civilians. I mean, the target of the attack has to be the civilians. And the purpose is to instill fear. But the vigilante groups had no purpose, no target of attacking civilians. They were fighting against the rebels, and they were not instilling fear in anybody. They were protecting their community. He said, so you cannot convict them for war crimes. Today, you're sending the wrong signal that even when your people are being killed, you should not defend them. He was the only dissenting opinion. When they appealed the judgment to the appeals court chamber, the only Sierra Leonean judge also was the only dissenting opinion on the CDF case. He supported the findings of the Sierra Leonean judge at the trial chamber. he said he did agree with almost all the dissenting points, and he went further that the special court was set up on a racist international conspiracy to bring to book people who had fought for the people of Sierra Leone. He went further to say, my people were being killed, where were you? You know, it is important to note that almost every Sierra Leonean was a victim of the war. Just like it was in Kenya. If you have Sierra Leoneans sitting, I think the Sierra Leonean mentality is that the rebels were the perpetrators, were the bad guys, and the vigilante guys were the good guys. So that really undermined the final outcome of the special court. And it is very important to note this. But it's also important to note that if you don't have locals sitting on this court, you also miss that ingredient of a local point of view. So it's a delicate balance to strike. While the local judges were appointed by the government of Sierra Leone, the international judges were appointed by the international community. Another thing that I want to point out is the issue of funding. I think one of the problems that the special court in the TRC faced were the unpredictability of the funding that were coming through. From the onset, the United Nations had not wanted both mechanisms to be funded by the UN, because that would have been requiring a lot of bureaucratic processes. So you had donations coming from nations, and I think Australia was one of the major donors of the special court, particularly. But these fundings were not very certain. So at some point in time, the state will pledge $1 million or $10 million, and they will pay just 10% of that. And so there was always the uncertainty as to where the funding will come for the next year. Yet you have people who were incarcerated waiting for trial, but there was uncertainty of funding. So I think, in a nutshell, if you want to set up a hybrid court, you have to be sure of where the money is coming from. You have to be sure that there's money for the entire process. Because even when Mr. Taylor, Judge Taylor from Liberia, was brought to The Hague, the trials were interrupted a couple of times because of funding constraints. And one of the tactics that Mr. Taylor was using was to drag on the trials. So, for example, he said I was going to bring 300 witnesses. He knew 300 witnesses would take 2-3 years. And he knew there would be problems with funding. And so funding is a major issue that has to be grappled with. There's a major issue in international law which I want to talk about, which is the issue of equality of arm. The Office of the Prosecution was given all the resources, and the Office of the Defense were practically starved of resources. I think the purpose of international law should not be, let's get somebody as a case study, let's get somebody by all means. I think it should be justice at the level where we could see justice being done in a fair and equitable manner. But if you have defense counsels with no resources, with no investigators, or one investigator to all the defense counsels, and that's an issue that we need to consider highly. At the special court, that was one of the major issues that we faced when we defended the accused persons. And I think it's very critical that when we set up a hybrid court, we also try to ensure that the defense office is very resourced. It's also very resourced as the prosecution, so that we can get justice in a proper manner. Having said this, I think I have exhausted most of what I wanted to talk about, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll take questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Emmanuel, for such an incredibly engaging and interesting talk. I think we have time for maybe one question, if anyone has one.
Hi.
Already?
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm from the United States. Thanks for coming and telling your story. I just wanted to ask, in terms of the success of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how would you compare it to the ones in South Africa and Rwanda in terms of their success? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the most successful Truth Commission that I have seen is the one in South Africa. You know, they're completely different, and I think everybody was willing to come out. And that's because the South African culture is different. In Sierra Leone, the Truth Commission was plagued with a lot of challenges. But primarily, one of the major issues that we had with the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone was that it was completely different from what Sierra Leoneans would otherwise would have done, you know, at the end of the conflict. And so it was just completely an alien concept to some extent. But importantly, I think also the Commission took too long to come out with its findings in Sierra Leone. So at the point in time when they came out with all of these reports, the government has set up a lot of these institutions. And the government did not help the situation. They came out with a white paper and saying, oh, thank you for the reports, we appreciate $4.6 million being put into this, but we think we have done this, and this. Practically undermining the report, even though historical records are now there as to what went wrong. The Rwandan Truth and Reconciliation, I still have questions about it. So I admire the reparation program which they set up. I am not too sure you can compare the South African and Sierra Leonean outcome in terms of legacy to that of the Rwandan system. Okay.